So Plato argues that freedom is fundamentally destructive, that freedom leads to the most bitter form of slavery. And so he reacts against freedom. He wants to argue that freedom, being fundamentally destructive, has to be suppressed. And as we'll see in his ideal city-state in the Callipolis, freedom is negated to emphasize the universal. So the universal is emphasized at the expense of subjectivity, at the expense of freedom, which for Hegel is a mistake. For Plato, however, justice is more important than freedom. And so he puts justice and the universal above freedom, above the particular. But according to Hegel, this relegation, this reduction of freedom to just destructive particularity, which Plato so vividly describes, shows that Plato really failed to grasp the full dimension of freedom. He relegates freedom only to one of its most destructive moments, but he fails to appreciate its full scope. So today I will provide this reading, which is based largely on just a few passages in Hegel's philosophy of right. I will try to defend this thesis of Hegel. But before we jump into this reading, let me differentiate between Plato's own self-understanding of his project, of his book, and how Hegel understands it. Because those two philosophers have very different conception of what philosophy is and different relation to their own work. So for Plato, a philosopher is somebody that has to transcend the particularity. They have to transcend time and space and perceive these universal, eternal forms. So in Book 6, Plato creates a very firm distinction between opinion and knowledge. Opinion is always tied to something particular, whereas knowledge grasps these eternal, timeless, spaceless forms. And so he talks about beauty, and he gives the example of artists. He says, artists, they see particular things, and they're beautiful in some way, ugly in other. No particular thing is beauty itself. To see beauty itself, to grasp beauty itself, you have to transcend these particular things and grasp the form of beauty, beauty that can only be grasped by the philosopher. So only the philosopher can have knowledge of beauty, because they transcend these particular things that artists concern themselves about. They transcend the cave, these shadows tied to sense perception, and through reason they grasp the form outside of any particularity. And Plato's project in the Republic is to grasp the nature of justice. So Plato transcends his own context and grasps the true universal nature of justice. For Hegel, every philosopher is a child of his day, as Hegel writes in the preface to Philosophy of Right, and famously, the owl of Minerva begins its flight only with the onset of dusk. So a philosopher, for Plato, cannot transcend his own historicity, his own situatedness. They give an expression to their situatedness. So, according to Hegel, what Plato is doing, he's not grasping the universal form of justice, but he's giving an expression of the Greek way of life, of his time and place in history, just as it's about to come to a close. So, what Plato is doing in the Republic is he is giving a description, a manifestation of the essence of the Greek ethical life, and he's identifying the principle, so freedom, which will lead to its destruction. As Hegel writes, world history is the necessary development of the moments of reason and hence spirit, self-consciousness, and freedom. So history for Hegel moves in this linear progression to its absolute knowing, the end of history, where the philosopher will be able to then grasp all of the moments. But right now, since history is still developing, Plato is limited. He's limited in his ability to understand, to grasp subjectivity, to grasp freedom as they're still unfolding. And so for Hegel, Plato misconceives freedom. Although he realizes that it will be freedom that leads to the destruction of Greek ethical life, he's not able to fully grasp it, and so he just reacts against it. So to understand what Plato means by freedom and how Plato seems to understand freedom and why he thinks it's so destructive, we have to understand the development of tyranny. And for Plato, tyranny comes from freedom. So as Plato writes, in all likelihood, democracy, and only democracy, lays the foundation of despotism. That is to say, the most intense freedom lays the foundation for the heaviest and fiercest slavery. So for Plato, freedom is envied and admired by many. But what they don't see is how destructive freedom really is. And if a society is built around freedom, as democracy is, they will descend into anarchy and tyranny. So freedom is fundamentally destructive and leads to unfreedom, leads to its very opposite. So society shouldn't be built around the concept of freedom, but around the concept of justice. So how do we get tyranny? Well, for Plato, there are in principle 5 different constitutions, and each of the constitution corresponds to a certain archetype. So you have the Callipolis, and the Callipolis is the ideal city, which I'll discuss in more detail. But the Callipolis is the just city, a city in which all of its classes exist in natural relation of control. The philosophers, the ones endowed with wisdom and reason, they're the ones that rule. They know what is good. Whereas the money makers, they make money, they produce, they distribute. The soldiers, they guard, they wage war. So each class does what it's supposed to do, what it's natural for it to do, and they exist in natural relation of control. But, as Plato writes, everything that comes into being must decay. The Callipolis, because they will mess up the breeding process, I'm not really sure exactly how that works, but apparently there is a very specific time and ratio and way of organizing the breeding process, which the rulers of the Callipolis will then mess up. They will also mess up the education eventually. Less emphasis will be placed on music and philosophy, more on physical training, on gymnastics. And that's how the Callipolis will degenerate into democracy. Unfortunately, I cannot spend too much time explaining how each constitution degenerates, because otherwise this would be way too long. So I will just rush through it, I'm sorry. So democracy, you could think of Ned Stark. So it's a city-state that is ruled by honor and glory, gain, victory. So democracy is ruled by the themoudeus, the spirited part of the soul. And then from democracy you get oligarchy. Oligarchy is a constitution that is ruled by wealth, by money making, and so you no longer get a city-state where classes exist in natural relation of control. The oligarchy is a city-state where the money makers rule, and the other classes get repressed. So for Plato, oligarchy is far from ideal. Also, it leads to 2 city-states, as Plato writes. So oligarchy would fail to preserve unity. It would necessarily dissolve into 2 city-states, one for the rich, the other one for the poor, and these 2 city-states will hate each other. They'll get some kind of civil war, and then when the poor gain control, you'll get democracy. And democracy is ruled by the principle of freedom, and it's ruled by many. So majority rule of the people, of the mob. And then from that you get tyranny. And so again, let me emphasize, as I said, that for Plato, each of these constitutions correspond to a certain moral disposition, a certain archetype. So the Callipolis, the philosopher, the democrat with Ned Stark, some military general, oligarchy with Scrooge, with some oligarch figure, and democracy is this multicolored, complex, worldly individual that has seen everything, been everywhere, that has experienced all kinds of things. So it's a constitution that is envied, but as Plato writes, there's a very fuzzy line between democracy and tyranny, and eventually democracy necessarily devolves into tyranny, and that's when it becomes less desirable. So in order to understand Plato's political theory, the bedrock of it is his psychology, which also will be later critiqued by Hegel. So for Plato, your soul, your Geist, has 3 parts. There's the rational part, so the universal. Then there's the spirited part, and then there's the appetitive part. So the appetitive part is just desire, desire for food, for drink, for sex. So it's this brute within, to quote Lawrence. And the spirited part, the Themadeus, is basically the social appetite, the need for honor, the need for glory, the need for recognition. And it's also the part which gets angry, which gets ashamed at ourselves. So in Book 2, Plato gives an example of a soldier after a battlefield who's eyeing all these corpses. And he gets a lot of pleasure from looking at corpses. And he knows this is something to be ashamed of. And so the spirited part is angry at himself. And this anger, it comes from the spirited part, not from the appetite. So the spirited part is perhaps you could think of it as the appetitive part that is tamed by society, tamed by reason to act as its kind of bulldog. But also I'm going to leave this open, whether the spirited part is really distinct from the appetitive part or if it's some form of appetitive part but tamed. Okay, so this is just a summary of what I've been talking about, partly generated by AI. So Plato's regime, so aristocracy, its archetype, the principle according to which it's ruled by, the soul type, and then the danger also that each presents. So I would recommend you to really go through Book 8 and Book 9. Plato beautifully describes how each constitution descends, degenerates into the other one, and how an aristocratic father gives rise to a democratic son. So this father-son dialectic is used to explain the degeneration. For example, Plato writes, well, when you have the aristocratic father, this philosopher, he'll be very detached. He won't care at all about his particularity, his personal interest. He'll be very aloof. He won't care so much about his wife. He'll be very indifferent to most things, to worldly things. He'll just be flying in these, in the Platonic realm, trying to perceive the forms. And so then the son will grow up in this household with this father who barely pays attention to him, who doesn't care about his own status. And then the son will gradually rebel against philosophy, rebel against music, emphasize gymnastics, emphasize honor. He will also be influenced by his mother, so the wife, who feels ignored. He'll be influenced by the servants who tell him, look, your father, yes, he's this great philosopher, but he doesn't care at all about his status, his gain. Like, look at what this household has degenerate to. And so that's how the Democrat will be brought up. And then the Democrat, so somewhere like Ned Stark, they will live a life based on honor. They will shun all other desires. But gradually, as they grow older, it's possible that they will be slandered, that they will be dishonored by their own city. The property will be seized, maybe due to a loss at war. So you have this general that has lived all his life according to honor, now dishonored, dispossessed, property taken away from him. And so you get the oligarch son, a son that rebels against this honor-driven father and emphasizes wealth above all else. And then from the oligarch, you get a democrat, and from democrat, you get the tyrant. But on this transition, let's focus a bit more. So an oligarch is someone who establishes his appetitive and money-making part on the throne, setting it up as a great king within himself. So he doesn't admire anything but wealth and wealthy people, and money-making is his chief aim, so he enslaves his other desires as vain and satisfies only his necessary appetites. So for instance, Scrooge, he comes home, he doesn't even switch on the lights, he has a lot of money, but because darkness is cheap, Scrooge likes darkness. So money-making is the sole focus of that person. It's a pretty boorish existence. So his soul is ruled by the appetitive part. And then this boorish oligarch will give rise to a democratic son. A son that has been brought up pretty comfortably, not in poverty. So recall that the oligarch son was brought up in poverty because his father was dispossessed, dishonored, property was seized. And when you grow up in poverty, you start caring about money. Money starts being something important. But if you grow up pretty comfortably, you start to see this obsession with money as pretty boorish, pretty limited. And you free all other desires. So not just the desire for money making, but also desire for girlfriends, for feasts, even for philosophy. So a democrat for Plato is somebody who makes all his desires free and equal. And he applies this throughout his life, throughout his existence, to all spheres. And so Plato writes, democrat is somebody who can do, kickboxing in the morning, smoke weed in the day, and then do philosophy at night. They have no order, they have no necessity, they don't privilege any desire above other, and they just work hard, play hard, and it's a life that might be envied by some. It's multicolored, it's complex. The democratic constitution, the democratic disposition, is one that harbors the most of the constitutions. So at times the democrat can behave like an aristocrat, at times like the democrat, at times like the oligarch. So there's no order, there's no necessity. It's all just freedom. But gradually this way of life leads to complete anarchy. And this complete anarchy then gives rise to tyranny. So Plato discusses how in the democratic constitution, freedom becomes applied to all spheres of life, authority becomes negated, rulers behave like subjects, subjects like rulers, a father accustoms himself to behave like a child and fears his son, a teacher is afraid of his students, a resident alien or foreign visitor is made equal to a citizen, dogs become like the mistresses, horses and donkeys are accustomed to roam freely and proudly. So you start to apply this principle of equality and freedom everywhere, because there's no way to say why you shouldn't apply it here and you should apply it there. And so to be consistent, you start applying it everywhere, and then, you have anarchy. So the democrat, as I said, is somebody that rebels against the thrifty nature of his father and makes all his desires equal, and yet he still is able to maintain some distance, some level of moderation. He's not ruled by any one particular desire. So he leads a life that is neither slavish nor lawless. But the person that becomes tyrannical is when he becomes drunk, filled with erotic love, and mad. So when he becomes enslaved by one particular appetite, becomes enslaved by this brute within. The democrat is somebody who can still balance high-form desire, low-form desire, philosophy, art, music, but also drinking and feasts and girlfriends, but maintain some level of moderation, some level of control, which he still learned from his oligarch father. The tyrant is somebody who grows up in a democratic household and who grows up in a democracy, becomes influenced by what Plato calls these drones. And drones are vagabonds, delinquents, these gangs that become very parasitic. They grow in an oligarchic city due to this civil war and inequality and poverty, and they also exist in a democratic city. And they affect the youth, and they affect the son of a democrat. They give him all these bad thoughts, all these bad influences, and gradually the tyrant becomes ruled completely by some kind of erotic desire. A tyrant is best compared to an addict who just seeks constant transgression. He cannot get more of it. So you know that if you're addicted to something, you're always thinking about it. You can never focus on anything. It's always there. Oh, I wish I could just go home and do this and do that. And you're not able, in a way, to maintain an existence, because at each moment you're just thinking about that. You're ruled by it. You're ruled by this erotic desire, whether for power, whether for love, whether for some kind of drug. In a way, for Plato, they're all the same. They're all forms of tyranny. And the worst possible outcome for a tyrant, somebody of a tyrannical disposition, is actually to become a leader, to become a real tyrant. They're the worst. They're the most envious, the most untrustworthy, the most unjust people. the most paranoid. So Hegel shares Plato's critique of this unfettered particularity, this frenzied madness. As Hegel writes in his critique on civil society, so this market system, that yes, desire is boundless. Human beings expand the desire and extend them to false infinity. Particularity is boundless extravagance, and the forms of this extravagance are boundless. But for Hegel, particularity, so submitting to your particular interests, your particular desires, is not all that freedom is about. As we'll see, for Hegel, freedom is the union of the universal and the particular. It's their reconciliation. What Plato is doing, he's posing two poles. Well, either you have the universal and you live according to reason and necessity, or you have no necessity, no order, and you live just according to your particularity. Just these two poles that cannot, in principle, be reconciled. But for Hegel, they can be reconciled, and they do. And that is what subjective freedom is all about, the reconciliation of the universal and the particular. So the Callipolis, so the ideal city, is what is supposed to oppose tyranny, oppose democracy, oppose this principle of destructive particularity. And the Callipolis, as we'll see, completely subsumes subjectivity, subjective freedom. There is no personal interest, personal gain. It is not a matter of making any one group, any one individual happy, but it's about the city. It's about the whole of the city-state. And the guardians, the soldiers, the rulers are not able to acquire private land, houses, currency themselves. They're not able to even hold their own wives. Because as soon as you have property, as soon as you say, this is mine, well, that creates conflict. That creates particular interests that are opposed to the interests of the universal, to the interests of the city-state. So Plato doesn't allow for it. The guardians should be brothers. There shouldn't be any room for conflict. So there shouldn't be any room for particularity. You're not allowed to choose your profession in the Callipolis because it's decided for you. Just because something makes you happy doesn't mean you're good for it, doesn't mean you're destined for it. You're not allowed to make that choice. The choice is made for you. And so in the Callipolis, you have all kinds of lies and falsehoods, all kinds of indoctrination. Just like a doctor needs to take care of the patient, the rulers have to take care of the subjects. And so they will tell them that the God who made you mixed some gold into those who are adequately equipped to rule. That's how they will justify their own rule. It's by necessity that we rule. While he put silver into those who are auxiliaries, and iron and bronze in the farmers and craftsmen. And so people will not be allowed to choose a profession. The profession will be decided for them, and they will be told that this is natural, this is your destiny. So there won't be any room for subjectivity, any room for this existentialist kind of freedom, where you define your own essence. The essence is already chosen. So this is a scene from The Giver, which I think very nicely embodies the spirit of the Republic. I recommend you to watch it. It's a good film. It's called The Giver. I think there's an old one and there's a newer one. Both are pretty good. Okay, so what is it about subjective freedom that Plato misconceived? Because for now this has been pretty vague. And unfortunately it'll still remain rather vague. So, according to Hegel, Plato misses this moment of singularity. He misses this moment when universality and particularity can be reconciled, which is ultimately what Hegel views as subjective freedom. While Plato just relegates freedom to particularity and opposes it with the universal, but the universal and the particular have to work together. You cannot just repress one at the expense of the other. So Plato lacks the concept of self-consciousness, which has being for itself. As we saw with Plato's tripartite division of the soul, you're always ruled by something external, either by reason or by your appetite, but it's a philosophy of mastery, of one part of the soul of another. They're not reconciled, they're not united in a moment of a singular I. So self-determination, autonomy, this conception is missing. Rosen, who wrote a very nice article on self-consciousness in Plato's system, argued that even self-knowledge is in principle impossible because you grasp the form and no form grasps itself. And so, in a sense, this self-reflexivity this moment of singularity, self-consciousness and self-determination is just not there in Plato. So in the philosophy of right, Hegel divides world history into four realms: the Oriental realm, the Greek realm, the Roman realm, and finally the Germanic realm. And of course, there's a lot of very problematic racism there. But here I will abstract from it and just focus on the Hegelian critique of Plato. I will certainly also have a very critical video of Hegel eventually. But for Hegel, in the Greek realm, the decision of the will is not yet assigned to the subjectivity of self-consciousness, which has being for itself, but to a power which stands above and outside of it. So you don't really make your own choice. Choice always comes from somewhere. Either it comes from your nature, so the kind of goal that you are manufactured by, or it comes from the family you were born to, the position you find yourself in. But this conception of autonomous self-determination is missing. Particularity associated with need has not yet become part of freedom, but is confined to a class of slaves. So this particularity, particular interests, are seen as something just fundamentally destructive, to be completely opposed. But for Hegel, particularity is also an important moment in subjectivity and cannot be completely dismissed. So in the Callipolis, this negation of someone's right to choose their own profession displays that. So Plato misses the moment of singularity, the reconciliation of the universal and the particular, which we have in Hegel. So I will then leave the question, well, how do the universal and the particular become reconciled? What is Hegel's conception of freedom in a more detailed manner? I will leave that for future work. So here I did provide a critique of Plato. I very briefly explained Hegel's conception of freedom as a kind of reconciliation of universal and particular, whereas for Plato they are in principle irreconcilable, and you should oppose the particular with the universal, through the universal. So in my future work, I will try to crystallize Hegel's position even more. And I might do that by first turning to Stirner. So Stirner, just like Plato, is stuck in this, well, either we have the universal or we have the particular, their irreconcilability. But unlike Plato, Stirner sees tyranny in the universal. And I think it's interesting to provide Stirner's insight. Stirner himself was a Hegelian, and he came actually after Hegel, and yet he comes to a very un-Hegelian outcome. He fails to recognize the necessity of Aufhebung, of sublating the universal and the particular. Okay, so I hope to see you in my future video.